Straight ahead, world leaders are gathering in Washington for a series of economic meetings. We'll check out what's going on inside and out. Dozens of people are homeless tonight after a fast-moving fire at a Manassas apartment complex. Plus, a small plane caused quite a big scare on Capitol Hill today. We'll show you what happened when it flew into restricted airspace. Good evening, everyone. I'm Beverly Kirk, and this is Live Tonight at 5.
From across Maryland, Virginia, and the District, this is Washington's 24-hour local news leader. News Channel 8's Live Tonight starts right now.
World leaders will gather in Washington this weekend for the annual IMF and World Bank spring meetings. The focus of this year's gathering will be ways to curb the global economic recession. But as always, what happens outside these meetings draws just as much attention. News Channel 8's Suzanne Kennedy is live tonight in Northwest with more on some of the IMF protests planned throughout the city. Hi, Suzanne.
Beverly, police are staged throughout this area near the IMF and World Bank headquarters. There is a lull in activity right now as protesters prepare for this weekend's event. But the crowds of protesters aren't as big as they have been in years past. A weekend of demonstrations to the World Bank and IMF meeting started midday with what was called a 5K run on the banks.
The IMF and the World Bank!
A small group of protesters ran through downtown Washington to voice their concerns about the policies of the two international organizations.
The IMF and the World Bank's failed policies don't work, and the last thing that the G20 needs to be doing right now to try to address the economic crisis is actually giving the IMF another $1.1 trillion.
At many points during the day, the police outnumbered the protesters. It's a far cry from this scene 9 years ago when thousands of people converged on the district for the meetings.
It's not near the violence that we saw in the early part of the 90s, right after the WTO protests in Seattle and the IMF World Bank protests here.
Today's participants blame low turnout on protest fatigue.
We're not seeing the numbers that we once did for this cause, but I think we will again. I think there'll be an explosion of populist outrage.
Dozens of protests are planned through the weekend. As the world's financial leaders meet under tight security, protesters will continue their efforts to speak out against their policies.
We should build a better world, and I think it's not up to the politicians to do that. It's up to us.
The next demonstration is planned for early tomorrow morning. That's when the protesters plan to block the hotels where World Bank and IMF meeting participants are staying in an effort to disrupt those meetings. One final note, there will be street closures and parking restrictions in this area, so unless you have business in downtown Washington, you probably want to stay out of this area. Reporting live in Northwest Washington, Suzanne Kennedy, News Channel 8.
Suzanne, thank you very much. Joining me now live with more on the protests is Lacy McAuley with Global Justice Action. And Lacy, great to see you. Thanks so much for being here tonight. We saw you there in Suzanne's story after you had just run a 5K race. So tell me, what exactly are you protesting?
Well, basically we're protesting the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, which we believe are basically failed policies that are only causing increased devastation in the countries in which they're involved. And in addition, the fact that specifically the G20 has recently decided that they would like to give the IMF $1.1 trillion more in funding for the bailout, which we believe is the last thing that needs to happen. We think it's sort of the equivalent of giving a drug dealer control of rehab, basically.
Can you tell us specific examples of the policies you think that are hurting people, not helping?
Well, basically, the neoliberalism policies are policies that, they basically deconstruct social services that are vital social services that people need. For one thing, when it comes to needing a social safety net in times of economic crisis. So exactly the type of social services that people are needing right now, access to health care, help with food subsidies, help with unemployment insurance, these types of things are the types of policies that the IMF and the World Bank work very specifically to undermine.
And undermining them how? I guess I'm not following how exactly do they undermine it?
Well, you know, the World Bank loans money and gets interest like any bank, and the IMF is the same. It loans interest out, it loans money out and collects interest. And in doing that, it doesn't just loan countries money, it actually holds the money back and tells countries that if you want this money, you are going to have to make this reform, this change. And countries basically, they usually have no other choice.
Now, talk about the things that you're planning to do to disrupt the meetings.
We have a very fun weekend of action planned. There are going to be events that are civil disobedience, and in addition, there are going to be some permitted family-friendly events. Tomorrow, we're actually going to be starting off the morning with an exercise dance party themed roving street party, and that's starting at 7 a.m. in DuPont Circle, and that will be just kind of a fun, sort of creative form of resistance, essentially, to the IMF and the World Bank. And there are going to be other acts of civil disobedience throughout Saturday morning. Saturday afternoon at St. Stephen's Church, 16th and Newton in DC, there's going to be a People's Economic Forum, 1 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And we're basically going to meet to plan our own ways forward and talk about our own new ideas.
We're running out of time, but I have to quickly ask you this, because it's the question on every Washingtonian's mind, because they say these protests happen and really they don't disrupt the meetings, they just disrupt the lives of the people who live here in Washington who have nothing to do with the IMF or the World Bank.
Well, basically, the meetings have security perimeters, which are huge in the first place, and that's the main disruption. For example, I mean, we have actually planned several permitted family-friendly events. It's just like a parade, essentially, so it's kind of the equivalent of, you know, a parade, and the traffic, you know, is on a Sunday afternoon, it's not going to be that bad anyway. So the event that we've planned for Sunday is 2 p.m. starting at DuPont Circle, and that's going to be a fun kind of lively march with music and speakers so that you can learn more about the IMF and the World Bank, and that goes from DuPont Circle to the World Bank, again starting at 2. And
let me interrupt. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but Lacy McAuley, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
The Metropolitan Police Department has declared an all-hands-on-deck weekend to keep an eye on the protests. The declaration means no sick leave Saturday or Sunday or days off for any MPD officers, regardless of rank. Top brass said that they will be ready for whatever the weekend might bring. Coming up a little later on Live Tonight, we will chat with an economic expert for more information on what the world leaders hope to accomplish with these weekend meetings. A new World Bank report says the global economic crisis